Hello, everyone. This is your host, Nevin for another episode of the Populist Patriot. And with me is our recurring guest, geopolitical analyst and national security expert, J.R. Nyquist. He is a prolific author of several books on national security, the threat of Russia, China, and other forms of totalitarianism and communism. Today, we're going to be having a special war report about the conflagration and war going on in Ukraine, committed by Russian aggressors and their allies in the so-called Donetsk People's Republic and Luhansk People's Republic. And thank you for joining us, Jeff, for tonight's program.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. So, Jeff, does it look like that we're going to have one clenched fist right now? Because it seems like everything is lining up together. Putin is rebuilding the Soviet Union or some version of it. He is flexing his muscles again. What is your take on what's going on?
Well, I've long suspected that the defector Anatoly Golitsyn was right in not about everything, but about the general structure of Russian and Chinese strategic thinking, communist, what we call the communist bloc. And so he made all these predictions in 1984 when he wrote the book New Lies for Old. But the two key predictions, if he was right about them sticking to this strategy, that is Beijing and Moscow, what we would expect to see are two things. Ukraine would be brought back into union with Russia, and something like the Soviet Union brought back, if not the Soviet Union. And the other thing we would see is Russia and China united together. And that's what we're seeing. Russia and China. You maybe saw you lost something on the floor.
Yes, I had to plug in my computer because it's running low on battery. My apologies to you as well as the audience.
Oh, okay, good. It's a good idea not to lose power, and that's kind of important. This is a strategic calculation. We have always thought two things in the West. Two things have been the basis of our strategic calculations. One is that the Soviet Union collapsed and that Russia is no longer a strategic threat. The other one is that China wasn't a strategic threat. It was our partner against the old Soviet Union and our economic partner because we have so much trade with it. Both of these premises are wrong, I submit. China is a communist country. They're using economics in order to build up their war machine to come after us. And Russia, the collapse of the Soviet Union was to get us to take our attention off of them so they could rebuild and come back at us again too. And that we are at what Golitsyn called one clenched fist. Yes, that would be right. And I've been looking for evidence that Golitsyn's wrong. I'm hoping somebody's going to come up with something soon because this is starting to look really grim right now.
Oh, yes, it is. I mean, the stars are aligning, the red stars, so to speak. We have so far Nicaragua, Cuba, Iran, and a few of the other, Syria, amongst others, that so far are lining up behind recognizing the openly communist states of Donetsk People's Republics and the Luhansk People's Republic. What was it? Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Iran, and Syria. You have China, which has long been an ally of the Russians, and even despite the vastly overstated Sino-Soviet split, still cooperated with Moscow from the 1960s until the 1980s on various projects. And now it looks like China is tilting towards the Russian Federation, even offering economic and financial assistance in the event that Western and American sanctions are tightened. And
Right.
Also are saying that they seem to be somewhat endorsing Moscow's war against Ukraine as well. So it looks like it's one clenched fist. Putin is threatening massive retaliation, things that we have never seen here in the West and the United States in the event that the sanctions are deepened. So really and truly, we have made colossal mistakes in becoming interdependent, obviously, with the People's Republic of China and even to some degree the Russian Federation. And both the left and the right, much of the left and the right, with exceptions, have been so wrong. And again, when I was thinking about doing some preparation for the program, I was reminded of that article that was written in Pravda some years ago by Dmitry Sudakov. And for the sake of the audience, I'm going to read it again because it is very prophetic. Sudakov wrote, the West, having discarded Russia, had been cutting its tanks and destroying tactical nuclear weapons. Russia, feeling its own weakness, kept all tanks and tactical nuclear weapons. As a result, Russia overcame the inertia of collapse and started reviving its power, while the West, being lulled by sweet daydreams of the liberal, meaning classical liberal, end of history, castrated its armed forces to the point when they could be good for leading colonial wars with weak and technically backward enemies. The balance of forces in Europe has thus changed in Russia's favor. When the Americans realized that, it was too late. Bam.
That's Pravda. And what is that? 2015 or 16? What's the date on that? I
Uh,
remember reading that.
yeah,
In
let me
fact,
look at
I
my.
I put that in my last book. That article is quoted in my last book. That was a two-part series that Pravda did, um, and
That
they were
was
yeah.
from no, that was written November 13th, 2014,
Oh, too really
in an
okay.
article titled "Russia Takes Complete Advantage of Castrated Armed Forces of the West." Dmitry Sudakov. It's
In
even
in
in the
in
title.
Pravda, in Pravda, in Pravda, yes.
Correct.
Yeah, no, I remember being stunned by that because that's the sort of "ha ha, we got you" article, and that was, gosh, that was 7 years ago, last November that article came out. That's incredible. They know that they got us then. They were bragging about it, but nobody noticed. They're even bragging. And so you can imagine, look, what's happening now is a very large European country by European standards. Ukraine is a large country. It's being invaded. The invasion started in the wee hours of yesterday. Um, well, let's see. Well, today they're 7 hours ahead in Ukraine, so it's getting a little confusing. But the invasion started early Wednesday morning, Ukraine time, on the 23rd, and it started with here's the missile strikes even in western Ukraine near Lviv, missile strikes near um, the south of Lviv in western Ukraine, missile strikes against Ukraine's military headquarters north of Kiev. They have apparently occupied Chernobyl, the Russians have, with ground forces. Russian helicopters have attacked Kiev. I understand several Russian helicopters have been downed. There were reported last night, I'm not sure if this was confirmed, Russian commandos had seized one of the airports near Kiev, that they were Russian paratroopers were on the outskirts of Kiev, possibly surrounding or cutting the city off. The Russians are reported amphibious landings behind Mariupol and near Odessa. They have secured the Dnieper water canal to Crimea, so that the tanks have broken up out of the Crimean Peninsula. Helicopters have secured bridges on the lower Dnieper and crossing points. Um, they have advanced down the highway 50 kilometers from the Russian border to Kharkov, or the Ukrainians call the city Kharkiv. You've got, of course, the fighting and artillery uh, duels, ground assault in Donetsk, and basically you have a number of Russian warplanes shot down. The Russians attacked the Ukrainian Air Force in its airfields, attacked surface-to-air missile systems. So this is a full-blown assault, full-blown war. Um, And it seems because the ground is not as frozen. I mean, it was 40 degrees in Kiev yesterday with rain. I think it was partly rainy today. The ground is pretty wet. And outside the paved roads, tracked vehicles do better, but they're going to have a slower invasion than they would have if it had been really cold like it is here in the upper Midwest. It's like I think it's like 7 degrees out here right now, but that's the temperatures they needed there to make their advance work. And of course, the Arctic air on top of the North Pole, it either goes into North America or it goes into Eurasia, into Russia. So it can't go both ways. So we got the cold. They didn't. They've got more of the warming weather. And so it is not ideal, but the Russians using air mobile forces and are, using air power and missiles, they're moving ahead. And I think it is a double envelopment attack. They are coming down along the Polish border in the far west. There's troops reported there, and there's troops coming down on Kiev from north, from Belarusia. Amphibious landings again on the south, coming up from Crimea, and of course the main front in the east. And it is all closing in. It's a double envelopment, basically. And that's sort of how it's playing out. The big mistake that was made by the Ukrainian government, by President Zelensky, is he should have mobilized the Ukrainian military 3-4 weeks ago. Mobilizing the day before the invasion is probably a day too late, or 3 weeks too late, because it takes time to assemble men that are in civilians, 400,000 civilians, get them to their points where they can get their weapons and get into their uniforms and so on. That takes some time. And with the massive cyber attack, with the breakdown in communications, with military bases under attack, I just saw that Snake Island, a Ukrainian military position, was asked by a Russian naval vessel to surrender. They refused, and that every single Ukrainian on that island was killed by the missile strikes that hit the island. So the Russians are not being nice at all. They're moving in there. You surrender or we wipe you out. And they've got a bunch of new weapons. Putin has bragged that they've got weapons of war now that nobody's ever seen, that are unlike anything that have ever been deployed. They've got a new urban combat vehicle, so that if they want to resist in the cities, they can. I think they are prepared to encircle the cities and force the cities to surrender by encirclement, is my judgment. But they have moved into the outskirts, I understand, of Kharkov. There are reports unconfirmed of them paratroopers being in Odessa, and of course Kiev, and as well as other cities. So that's kind of an update on where the situation is. First full day of war is very confused. Really, for a campaign to play out, it's many days. A country this size, it could be 3 weeks or more. Especially with this weather, it could go till June, depending on the kind of resistance that the Russians encounter.
What do you predict in regards to the strengths of the Ukrainians that they have, the weaknesses? Well, you touched a little bit on the weaknesses already with the belated mobilization. And what are the strengths and weaknesses on the Russian side? From what
you get reports to give you variable numbers. It's claimed that the Russians are attacking with about 190,000 troops. I think the Russian numbers are larger, but that's what's being stated by credible sources. The Ukrainian army is 165,000, but the Russians have air supremacy right now. The Ukrainian Air Force is not a factor. One of the handicaps the Ukrainians have is that their army is although they only have 2 tank brigades, at full mobilization, I believe those would be brought up to divisions rather than brigades. That's 3 times of a brigade, 3 brigades in a division in their system of organization. They have like 5 helicopter or airborne or air mobile brigades. And the problem with that is that those are basically demobilized if your enemy has air superiority. They're just guys that are walking. They're the advantage of the mobility of the helicopters, because with Russian jet fighters controlling the skies, helicopters are just useless. They just get shot down. Helicopters are completely helpless to fighter aircraft. And so they have such a large number of helicopters. I was really surprised. But it was Ukrainian military was designed to be integrated in with the Soviet army, and they never really changed their order of battle to defend them from Russia, but rather it's a Carpathian facing. They still retain a mountain division, as if they were going to be moving west rather than defending from the east. Um, so it's yeah, it's the problem is that there's been some studies. There's been one study I know of that says that that the Ukrainian generals are well, they were captains and majors and lieutenants under the Soviet Union. They went to Soviet military schools. They have a certain nostalgia for the Soviet Union, and so there is not the just like all Western countries that have the certain element of Marxist sympathy, there are some of that in the Ukrainian military. Ukraine is not uh, a unified country in the sense of a unified, everybody's a Ukrainian nationalist. There's a lot of residual of the Soviet thinking in among certain elites in Ukraine, because that the Soviet structures still exist. They did not have lustration. That is, there was no Nuremberg trial of communism, despite the fact that communism killed, between 8, maybe 11 million Ukrainians in the Ukraine famine. We don't know the exact number. This was done by the communists, the Bolsheviks in Ukraine, on orders from Moscow, in tandem with the farm collectivization of Stalin in the early 30s. This was even a greater atrocity than the Holocaust by Hitler. In terms of the numbers of lives, it's always, how do you measure human life? But this is a horrific thing that Ukraine experienced. Um, but yet there are people who believed in the Soviet Union that are still there.
Well, and
So,
that leads me to a next question about the fifth column in Ukraine. I mean, before the secessions of Donetsk and Luhansk, I mean, there were different political parties. I think there was a Socialist Party, there was the Communist Party of Ukraine, there was the Party of Regions. I believe it was called Viktor Yanukovych. I mean, these were all parties and organizations that were nostalgic for the Soviet period, for communism and socialism, or ties with very strong ties with the Russian Federation. If you had to venture an educated guess or even have knowledge, what is the actual size and how effective is a sort of fifth column in Ukraine, in the Western Ukraine, west of the Donbass region?
well, Western Ukraine has always been an anti-Soviet hotbed, and been you got a lot of nationalism there. The reason why they're more west-facing is that part of Ukraine was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was kind of a liberal monarchical empire, and it was also at different times when Poland was a larger state in the interwar period. It was part of Poland. City of Lviv, for example, the biggest city in Western Ukraine, that was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then it was part of Poland after World War I. And then it was acquired by the Soviet Union when Poland was divided between Hitler and Stalin in 1939. And so that was really the center of Ukrainian nationalism in terms of the attitudes of people. It's also less likely to be Orthodox. There's more Catholics there. Um, and so there's a religious difference as well. So it's obviously the history of the country is complicated by this. But what's interesting is President Zelensky of Ukraine. This is an interesting side note. If you look at how he was elected, and overwhelmingly, by the way, he was elected by Western Ukraine and by people in Eastern Ukraine. He was popular in large majorities among all Ukrainians, whether they were East Ukrainians or West. So Zelensky has been a unifying figure. He is a comedian. He's a television person. And what's really interesting with the Russians calling the Ukrainian regime Nazis, you know, um, he's Jewish. Volodymyr Zelensky is Jewish. And, there's been people who've claimed, some people say, well, because of the support he got from this particular oligarch, that he is that he's really a shill of Moscow, just like Poroshenko was. We don't really know. I know Ukrainians who believe in Zelensky, and I know Ukrainians who believe Zelensky is a Russian shill. It's very hard to in any former Soviet country. It's very hard to know who is who and who is the real deal. One thing for sure, with Moscow attacking Ukraine, even some of these people who believed in the Soviet Union or communism have to start to question their belief by seeing this. Not all of them will, but it can definitely. Putin's taking a risk that he is going to harden Ukrainian national opinion. He is going to. Ukraine has. This is one of the reasons why he's doing this. Ukraine has been forming its own national identity. And I think the election of a comedian, a television hero, he played a high school. Zelensky played a high school professor on Ukrainian television. It's a very charming comedy, who accidentally gets elected president of Ukraine. He puts his hat in the ring because he's so upset at the corruption, and he doesn't expect to win. He doesn't even campaign. He just stays in his classroom, and he puts his name out there, and somehow everybody votes for him because they're so disgusted with all the other candidates. And so suddenly this humble high school teacher becomes the president, and so he wants to do an honest job, and the show is a lot of it is about the corruption in Ukrainian politics and how he innocently tries to fix it. And so people wanted him to be president because they wanted him to do it for real. It's a very interesting story.
It is very interesting, and he made quite a speech too, as well, and recently in his appeal to world public opinion and to the Russians, actually, too, as well, the Russian people.
Yeah.
What is your take on the American response and the NATO response? The economic and military responses given so far. What's your assessment?
Well, we don't actually know how that's going to fall out. There was Germany made these surprising declarations. Oh yeah, we're gonna cut the pipeline. We're going to kick
Nord
them out of
Stream
SWIFT.
2, not Nord Stream 1, by the way.
Right. And the problem is that they're not serious. The Germans, in principle, would like to put sanctions on Russia, but they're not willing to give up heat in the winter. The cost that they would have to bear would be just backbreaking for Germany. And the Russians have thought this out very well, making, and here Biden contributed to that because Biden cut our pipeline out. We had a way of shipping natural gas to Europe and supplying it to them. We could have done it instead of the Russians. We could have cut them out of it. But instead, they wanted to make themselves dependent on Russia. It was just doing that was a kind of a betrayal of Europe to Russia, because now Europe is pretty much helpless before Russia, and Putin's got to be laughing because the Germans have literally got to turn off their heat in the winter in order to punish Russia. Well, how does that punish Russia? The Germans are punishing themselves far more than they'd be punishing Russia. Now, the ruble has suffered terribly. The Russian stock market, last I heard, it collapsed 45%. It's just crumbling. Of course, you would expect it to. But their country they're not America. No, they don't. That's not Wall Street. Their stock market is not as important to their country. Although the average Russian is going to feel the pinch. There's no doubt. This decision by Putin, you see there are peace protesters all over major cities in Russia. They had 700 arrests in St. Petersburg today. I don't know. I know overall in Russia it's over 1,000 arrests, peace protesters. So there is a peace movement in Russia. It is being smashed by the police. They're not tolerating it. They're not going to allow it.
What are your thoughts about the American response, particularly the sanctions against the Russian army military-dominated bank, and then the VTB, which is another big, large financial institution, and the prospect of Russia getting kicked out of the SWIFT international banking
Let's
network?
talk about SWIFT. That was going to happen. Everybody thought, oh, this is a no-brainer. No, now it turns out that Italy, Germany, Hungary, Cyprus, they're not going to go along with that. They don't want Russia kicked out of SWIFT because it's going to hurt them too much. So there's too many players that are invested in trading and moving money around with the Russians, maybe for that to work. And then you have got the Chinese, who are big players. You know, they're a big industrial and financial power, lining up with Russia, saying we're going to, you know, support Russia economically and financially and in this. And of course, Russia has worked so that they can supply China and China can support Russia. So this is where this Chinese-Russian alliance is really coming into play. And of course, the real problem is the kind of power that Russia has, both with Iran in the Persian Gulf and with gas in Europe. And by the way, Russia right now is our second largest importer of oil into the United States. So who are the sanctions going to hurt? Um, they're going to hurt everybody. Are they going to hurt the Russians enough? The Russians are a much more stoical nation. Um, I think that I mean, Putin is showing uh, a kind of determination here. Though surprisingly, the Western leaders are talking in a determined way, but Putin is acting. Will we then act in a determined way, especially when the Russians have threatened to launch a major cyber attack on the East Coast if we sanction them?
Yes, and that's very, very serious. Talking about cyber attacking New York City and Washington, D.C., which is critical for our economy since we've been really economically focused on financial speculation as opposed to production. We've become so interdependent with Russia and China, more so China, but
More
even
so
Russia,
China.
but even surprisingly to some degree, Russia for rare earth metals to some degree, as well as oil and gas, because we've globalized, and this was pushed a lot by the conservative right. You know, I remember writing an article, a paper for Accuracy Media, and back years ago, which talked about PNTR for permanent normal trade relations for Vladimir Putin, which was one of the areas where Obama administration and much of the Tea Party leadership in both houses of Congress agreed. I mean, we take a look at the technology transfers to Skolkovo and Rusnano, which are basically the Russia's version of Silicon Valley, and that occurred under the watches of Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama in corporate America.
Right. And of course, you compare this kind of thing you're talking about right now. 7 minutes ago, strikes on Kiev began. So Kiev is being hit right now, and I'm looking at the pictures here on my phone of the strikes on Kiev. So, I mean, this is kinetic war. Look, if I'm going to blow your brains out and you're going to cancel my credit card, who wins?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you
Well,
blow
and
my
I just,
brains out and then you take my credit card, right?
yeah,
You take your credit card. You blow, you know, it's this whole balance between force versus, you know, what is power? Is power money or is power guns? Immediately, it's always guns.
ultimately, yes. I mean, in the Western plutocracies in America, plutocracy, money is power essentially, because for a variety of reasons we've become corrupted in a more genteel fashion compared to Russia or China,
Yeah.
where it's much more brutal. And Russia, money is just a tool of those who hold the guns, and they survey the way the totalitarian, you know this, of course, but the
Right.
totalitarian states weaponize capitalist greed and they use it against us. The
Yep. That's right.
Lenin, Hitler, Marx, they all understood, and I can quote them ad infinitum. They knew the weaknesses of the bourgeoisie. When you take a look at the
Yep.
upper bourgeoisie in this country, and look, on this show, we have no quarrel with people becoming wealthy because they're wealthy by honest means. That's not the issue. But when they do it to hurt the country and when they're deracinated from any sense of national identity, that's where I run into problems. And in order to survive, they politically need to be really put into their back in their box. And that's a different discussion for a different time. When you were talking about Germany's dependence on Russian natural gas, I was reminded, I looked it up in my book, my latest book, and back in November 2000, this is the kind of things, audience, that we're dealing with here, Vladimir Putin and the old Soviet structures in Russia. In November 2010, Putin mocked Germany's dependence on Russian gas in a speech before to assembled businessmen. He said, "How will you heat your houses? Even for firewood, you would have to go to Siberia." And this is what we're dealing with. We're not dealing with someone that, we can play patty cake with, essentially. I mean, this is a government, by and large, that is devoted to hegemony over Europe. But Jeff, is really Russia just interested in neutralizing Europe, or based on what you have been told by Yeltsin and Putin era defectors, does Russia really want to smack down the United States and really take us down? Or do they just want to stick and neutralize Europe? What is your take based on the information you're privy to?
They want to force our allies to abandon us. They want to separate us from our allies and have our allies neutralized so that they and their Chinese allies and their North Korean allies can advance directly on North America and completely finish us. That's in a short version of what I understand their strategy to be. Colonel Stanislav Lunev spoke about this. He'd had the plan described to him that Russia and China had agreed to this in the future, to conquering North America and dividing Canada and the United States between the two countries. Russia to get Alaska and parts of Canada, China to get the lower 48 states. This was negotiated. Chiao Chen alludes to it in his speech of 20 years ago about using biological weapons to clean up America. He said we traded land in the north with the Russians to get what we wanted in North America. This I think, is an allusion to what Lunev was talking about. You watch everything they've done, from the Russians building icebreakers so they can get their fleet across the ice sheet to Alaska, regardless of the time of year, to moving more forces into the Arctic, as if to lean closer to North America, to the Chinese building the biggest navy in the world in terms of the number of warships, and of course the development of hypersonic missiles to neutralize their carriers. Everything's calculated. They want sea control. The Chinese controlling the ports of entry in the Panama Canal, controlling so many ports in Latin America. The Russians and the Chinese and their communist allies in Latin America now taking control of so many countries. Peru, Venezuela, Argentina is with China. Chile now. I think the FARC is going to flip Colombia one of these days. You've got a number of Central American countries going over. Look, who knows what is going to happen with Mexico? And you look at Trudeau in Canada, and who the heck is Trudeau? The people are saying he is Fidel Castro's son, for crying out loud.
I've
And
heard
you look
that.
at his picture, and he looks like him. It's like,
He does.
what? Yeah, his mother had an affair with Fidel Castro. Of course, his
Yes,
father was a premier of Canada back when I was in grade school back in the late 60s. But the
and his
Trudeaus,
father started a detente. For those of you who don't know and might not be aware about Pierre Elliott Trudeau, he was elected, I believe, in 1969 and was prime minister up until off and on until the early 1980s. And he forged, continued, and even upgraded ties with Cuba. He allowed Cuban Air Force transports to occasionally land in Gander International Airport in Newfoundland in the mid-1970s. And those transport planes were on their way to then communist Angola. Actually, it still is under the control of the MPLA. He has hinted in some quotes of admiration for the authoritarian Soviet system. According to some sources, I don't have the quotes handy right now, but I have them in my electronic files. I believe he attended the International Economic and Trade Conference in 1952 in Moscow in an effort to try and upgrade trade ties with Western companies. Trudeau, I believe, participated in that back in the Cold War days of 1952 when Stalin was running things.
right? Well, yes, Trudeau.
Trudeau really leaned towards communists. He got Yuri Bezmenov, I believe, caused problems for Yuri Bezmenov. who was a Soviet Novosti and KGB Novosti official and KGB source. He got him like fired, I think, from the Canadian Broadcasting Company under pressure from the Soviet ambassador in Ottawa. I mean, the
By the
Trudeau,
way, the Soviet
Trudeau family
ambassador's
is
name
fully leftist.
was Alexander Yakovlev.
That's
Very
correct.
close friend of Gorbachev. Yakovlev wasn't just the Soviet ambassador, he was a close personal family friend of Trudeau, so much so that Trudeau named one of his sons after Alexander Yakovlev. And
Okay.
Alexander Yakovlev was one of the architects of the supposed collapse of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
He was the ideology chief under Gorbachev.
Yes, he
That
was.
and of course, there's something funny about Alexander Yakovlev. Something very, very not honest about Yakovlev.
Well, which hardline communist is honest? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah,
how do
yeah.
you know a communist is telling a lie, as you often say? Their lips are moving.
Their
Everything
lips
comes
are
out of
moving.
them as a lie.
Yeah, yeah. They lie even when they don't have to, as if to keep in practice. Um, and of course, this whole business of what's happening now, we can see that there were no democratic reforms in Russia, no real meaningful ones. There was no real capitalism. The essence of the Soviet system was turned into a system of oligarchs who were basically contracted by the KGB and the Communist Party Soviet Union underground. The same people who managed the Soviet economy basically run the structures of the Russian and largely the Ukrainian and other former Soviet republic economies now, today.
Well, according to one document that was declassified and smuggled out of the Soviet Union, translated data from 1990, which was when the Soviet Union still existed, it called it the invisible party economy. And when these, you see, what happened was, and this has been amply documented in, not crazy right-wing sites, but scholarly literature, actual documents that have been translated. Um, Basically, these entrepreneurs, if you want to call them very loosely, were creatures of the KGB. All these joint ventures that developed with Western companies or privatized companies, quote unquote, these were all under the tutelage of the KGB and various other Soviet Communist Party structures. This was planned ahead of time. This was planned back. This was planned. The seeds of this project was planned back in the early to mid 1980s. That's how far back this was planned, if not even perhaps. You look at Major Golitsyn, the KGB officer who defected in 1961, perhaps even longer. Um, but yeah, this is what happened. There's plenty of evidence to show that Putin still holds communist ideals. His cryptic interview in the year 2000 with a Cuban so-called journalist, where he was asked whether he was on the right or the left, and Putin said, "Call me a pot, but heat me not," which is a very cryptic saying of basically, I really don't want to reveal myself, but you know just as well as I do what I'm all
Right,
about.
right.
Putin in recent years has said communism and Christianity are very similar, that he still holds to communist and socialist ideals. Before the World Youth Festival, which is an old Soviet front that still exists in Sochi in
Yep.
2017, he said to assemble communists, including American communists like Caleb Maupin, who is an up-and-coming hardline communist, and he was in the audience, and Putin said, "I am with you. I am for you.
Mm-hmm.
I
Yes.
support you." I mean,
Yeah.
is this a Christian and a conservative? Which leads me to a point of massive frustration. We have conservative right-wing populists who might be good on certain issues, like Tucker Carlson and Michael Savage. Michael Savage did an about face. He used to have our friend Jimmy from Brooklyn
Yeah.
on the
That's right.
show. And
Yep.
I don't want to get on air. Jimmy has told me stories like he's told me about whatever. I'm not going to whatever, but let's just say Mr. Savage used him as a credible source. And by about 2012, but especially with the onset, let's say about 2015, 2016, Dr. Savage became ardently pro-Putin, thought he should join the world economy. It would be a good ally against Islamic terror. He wrote this in one of his books. I forget the title. I have it quoted in my book. And Tucker Carlson, who said for several years that Putin is not a threat, and now Ukraine is not an independent democracy, but it's a State Department client state. And then you have the hardline, tanky communists like Caleb Maupin, Haas, Infrared. You have the Communist Party USA to some degree, the Workers' World Party. When you scan the websites, they're all in for for the Russian invasion. I mean, first they were denying there was even a Russian invasion when the
Right.
invasion was happening. I mean, these are like
Right.
sick people. What's going on with the right and the left in this country? Because there are splits in both.
Right. Well, the thing is, people can't ever get it straight. There's look, disinformation is not one. There's not one Russian line of disinformation that's given to everybody. They give a line of different disinformation to the American conservatives, one to the European conservatives. They give a line to religious people. They give a line to non-religious people. They give a line to the left. So the Russians, they're all things to all people, right? Putin's a communist to the communists. He's a Christian to the Christians. He's a conservative to the conservatives. What is he really? He's a communist, of course, because he's restoring the Soviet Union. See? And he really is with the communist youth. You have to watch what they do, not what they say. And he's united with China, a communist country. He's supporting Cuba, a communist country. He's helping build military infrastructure in Nicaragua, a communist country. He is supporting the FARC, a communist insurgency. He's supporting Angola. The Russian planes didn't stop bringing supplies to Angola, a communist country. The Congo, a communist country, and so on. And of course, there's Russian military advisors in North Korea. If Putin is not a communist, you got to explain all this. It has to be explained, and it can't be. He is not pretending to be a communist. He is a communist, and all of these things he's doing are proving it. And yet people like Tucker Carlson, who want to put lipstick on this pig, who want to make Putin seem like a conservative and a Christian, and they want to believe, like people like Michael Savage, they're just not well enough informed. They don't know the history. They don't know the nuances of the collapse of the Soviet Union. You know, when you go at Golitsyn, you go, okay, I got to look to see if Golitsyn's falsified by what actually happened in the fall of the Soviet Union. You read Karen DeWish's book. I've mentioned this before. Or you Tremofiev's book, Russia's Secret Rulers. And oh my gosh, there's all this evidence showing that the Communist Party underground did everything. Now, DeWish may call it the mafia, but it is essentially the old structures, the Communist Party, the managers of the economy, the KGB, the GRU. They're the ones that are controlling the game, the communists.
And some of these oligarchs are openly communists who fund the open communist parties like Gennady Zyuganov's party.
Yeah.
And with Dr. Savage, I'm sorry, I got to disagree with you on that. He has spoken on a show before. I've quoted it in my latest book, Turning the Page. And he has basically talked about very hostile to Russia and China and whatnot.
No, I'm sorry. What did I say that was wrong?
No, I don't think Dr. Savage is ignorant. I think something happened with him.
Oh, you don't think he's ignorant? I do. I think he's ignorant.
I do not, because he knew beforehand. I have heard him say on his show, not criticizing, but pointing out the Russian and Chinese threat. And he had Jimmy from Brooklyn giving him all this information. And then for some reason, I don't know if he changed his mind or what. I don't want to speculate on air, but something happened where he just flipped. And people don't make those shifts that radically. I have really a hard time digesting that. Let me look it up because I think the audience should be aware of this.
Yeah. Psychologically, here's something people ought to know. And that is that, look, for me, I had my epiphany in 1987 where I was reading the defector literature. I was reading Jan Shana, and I found that Jan Shana was saying something very close to what Galitzin was saying. And he was very high up. He was saying that there was a plan to fake the collapse of the communist bloc. And that's in a chapter on the Soviet long-range strategy that begins in about page 100 of his book. We will bury you in. And what astonished me was there's two defectors saying this. And I started thinking things over, and by that time, I'd read a lot more in understanding how the Soviet system worked and how the KGB functioned and how Soviet strategy worked. And I realized, being in graduate school with these people going to RAND, going into the State Department, CIA, people, I was a I was a PhD candidate. I got to interact with people who were being educated to be the top advisors of our society about these subjects. And they were, in my view, severely misguided, and they did not understand the Soviet Union. They had ways of thinking that were given to them that blinded them to seeing these things. And I realized the Russian strategy was perfectly calculated to fool us, and it was going to work. They were going to fool us that they changed. We were going to fall into it. We were going to disarm or allow our nuclear arsenal to fall into disrepair, and they were going to emerge much stronger at some point in the future. I realized this was the future that we were facing. And the thing is that I was made to, all the writing, I started writing about this in 91. Actually, I started writing my book in 1987. And I have felt, and this is the honest truth, that I must be crazy, because everybody literally did not believe what I was saying. I felt like, what is it I'm missing that they don't think there's a problem and I do? And I am so concerned that we need to take this seriously. There must be you have to think there's something wrong with yourself. You have to. But I went over it in my head over and over again, and I would go over the books and I would go over the material, and I think, I just don't understand. Maybe I have a mental condition, but as I see things unfold in the last decade especially, I've thought, no, sadly, I'm not wrong. What you have to confront yourself with is that most societies and most times in history are deluded. Every single form of society has major delusions about reality. That is, every society, every civilization, every country, if you take the mindset of the people in that country, there are things they simply do not understand and they've got completely wrong.
And I think you're largely right about that, but I think there's also an issue of corruption, and there's treason, and
Well,
there's ideology, and other things. Let me read you what Savage said, and
okay.
I remember this. The communist murderers and their Arab brethren, along with the Russian bear, in many ways frighten me deeply. I fear that they will kill us, not just control us. I fear that there will be vast factories of slave labor in this country and vast factories of people being murdered. And he said that, this is on YouTube with his voice, Michael Savage, New World Order is serious business. I have the YouTube link in my book. And then, let's see, Savage wrote in his book, Trump's War. Putin is a conservative who has resurrected Russia's culture from the dustbin of history. He's restored its ancient Judeo-Christians and its market economy, and he also said Russia should be an ally in the war against radical Islam and a partner in the world economy. Both of these were stated or written when Vladimir Putin was the ruler. When you see this much of a shift, it could either be change of heart, but other things too that I will not say on air. I am very suspicious. And I think there are a lot of people not of goodwill or corruptible. I'm not saying Dr. Savage maybe didn't have a change his heart, but I think we have to be very hard in our analysis and realize there are a lot of very ill-intentioned people. There are people who might be good but have skeletons in their closet, like we all do in varying degrees, that we know the Russian, Chinese, and Cubans are very effective in using that. I've known somebody who was honey trapped by the Cubans. It is not a fun experience, let me tell you. So, yeah, We have to take a look at it. Alex Jones was another person. Before 2001, he was hostile to Putin. He said in 1999 that Putin was on an unbelievable power trip and claimed that he was known as Vladimir the Ruthless. He noted that Putin was an officer in the KGB and a creature of international communism. According to Jones's 9/11 coverage, the New World Order crowd armed China, who in turn armed Iran and Pakistan. Russia is playing possum, telling us that they're our friends while they roll out new supersonic long-range Topol M mobile missiles we can't pick off in a nuclear war. Media is telling us they're our friends when their own papers, they're laughing at us, arming our enemies, signing deals with the Taliban the day of the attack. But then by 2008, he's a Putin apologist and is interviewing Lyndon LaRouche, Webster Tarpley,
Yeah.
and Alexander Dugin as credible guests.
And Webster Tarpley is just a communist, basically.
He is a communist.
Yeah. So, and by the way, it's so funny for a communist to be coming on educating Alex Jones's audience when Alex Jones does not introduce him as a communist, does he?
No, he's cracked a few jokes about him, but still, he interviews him as my friend and as a credible guest.
Yeah. So it's with Alex Jones, look, I don't understand it, but do you think he has been persuaded, or do you think he has been, how do we know? We don't know a person's heart. Have they been manipulated, persuaded, or are they outright just doing it for the money, or are they blackmailed, as you say?
We don't know.
We don't know
because we don't have information to the archives of the Russians. We don't have FBI and NSA transcripts. There is something I did find. There was a testimony of Robin Drew, who was a former news director at InfoWars. Mm-hmm. According to Robin Drew, Alex Jones met with someone that she called Daria, the Russian operative at the office. I don't know. It's just, to me, when you look at, for example, the anti-American elements of the left that has existed for decades, they're always going to hostile foreign embassies, going to these so-called peace conferences. You have Medea Benjamin of Code Pink. I'm sure you've heard of her. I mean, I posted on my Facebook page, both my NatPop as well as my personal Facebook page, this Facebook posting of Medea Benjamin where she's just gushing over her friendship with I believe one of the former Cuban diplomat, Josefina Vidal, I believe, who is an officer in the Emlyn section of Cuban intelligence of the DI. I mean, this is what's going on. I mean, the Nazis had their same support networks in America. When you take a look at the declassified transcripts in the German Foreign Ministry and the Abwehr and the Gestapo and whatnot, they had a lot of American sympathizers. I talk about this in my books too as well. And they have a net. They use greed, they use ideology, they use money, they use blackmail, they use corruption, they use the idealism. I mean, I know communists, and one who recently passed away, a friend of mine, and he was very disillusioned. He went politically back and forth, and he was idealistic. You've pointed this out too. But when you get to many of the leaders, it seems like in the American context, people like the former Reverend Jim Jones, who's now dead, or Lyndon LaRouche, who recently passed away, these people are psychopaths. They're brilliant in their own way, and highly educated, if you take Lyndon LaRouche, but nuts. Absolutely nuts.
And Lyndon LaRouche, of course, was a teacher of Marxism-Leninism in the 1960s, who in 1971 founded the U.S. Labor Party, which was an early attempt to create a right-wing Marxist party, if you can imagine such a thing. So the way the right has been crafted, and in Europe and the United States, there is an effort. You've written a book, Useful Idiots on the Right, right? So this is the thing people don't understand. Conservatives often think that the useful idiot is a liberal who's soft on communism, who's been manipulated by the communists. We have in Patrick Buchanan and Tucker Carlson and many of these people, we have people who are the conservative equivalent of that.
Mm-hmm.
And as much as I admire Tucker Carlson and many of the things he's done, it's extremely disappointing to see in this most vital area that he's been taken in. And this is, And then you do talk about blackmail and bribery. And look, I'm the first one to tell you that if somebody were to ask me, what if I did what you were doing? What if I were to, well, I would warn them, you're not going to have a career. You're not going to have a good job. People are going to turn their backs on you. You're going to lose opportunities because if you say the truth about Russia and China and communism, you are you are marked down as an enemy of the most powerful mafia, the most powerful criminal gang on earth. And they take it very seriously. And there are people who are not breathing now, people that I have known or people that I've spoken to that were enemies of that same system.
Mm.
So it is not, we're not talking about some fantasy thing here. You look at the destruction in Ukraine right today. That is Moscow crashing down on a country of tens of millions of people and grabbing it. You think they're not capable of doing that to the United States and Canada? Of course they are. It's one of the things Colonel Lunev said is I trained for one mission in my career in the Soviet and the Russian military. It was nuclear world war against America. You think that's fantasy? You think that's crazy? That's the truth.
Well,
That's
they've
what they
written
trained for.
beautiful, brilliant military literature. I've read it. They're at the Florida, and translated into English down here in Boca Raton in the Florida Atlantic University of the translated works of Colonel Skirdo and General Sokolovsky.
Yep.
It's very well written. It's very
Yep.
historical. It's pretty impressive. I
Yeah.
mean, and I don't support them obviously politically back then,
No, but
but
they're
even
brilliant strategists. They're brilliant strategists. Sokolovsky, I mean, I can't, as a general, as a strategist, I really can't praise him too highly. He was the man who created the battle plan of the Soviet armed forces in the summer of 1944, Operation Bagration, that destroyed the German Army Group Center. It was the greatest defeat that Germany suffered in World War II, and he was the mastermind of it. It was really brilliant. And the same thing you could say about Skirdo. Skirdo's analysis of how to take down a large country and how to defeat a guerrilla insurgency and how to treat it and regard it and how to respect it it's a very imaginative um, work. The people, the commander in the army, and how all of these things integrate. How you think about politics in terms of war and how to win and not demoralize or destroy your own side, which, by the way, we Americans, our generals, our politicians, they haven't figured out how to win a war since World War II without demoralizing themselves.
Yeah. And then there's the other wing of the right that I can't stress enough is not only the sort of right-wing populists or paleoconservatives, but it's also a lot of the Beltway libertarians, a lot of your Tea Party and standard Reagan Republicans too as well, that believe in Reaganomics and the trickle-down economics, busting unions, globalization, and everything else. Take Orrin Hatch, for example. When the vote for permanent normal trade relations was up for a vote in 2012, Orrin Hatch, condemned Putin's Russia's human rights violations, the foreign trade malpractices, and the aggressive acts against the West in Europe and the Middle East and elsewhere. Yet Senator Hatch voted for PNTR for Putin in 2012. Or take Devin Nunes, who's cited as some sort of hero. Well, this I found, and it's in my latest book, Turning the Page. Devin Nunes gave a floor speech supportive of PNTR for Russia, and he said that times have changed. The Cold War is over, and the USSR has given way to the Russian Federation. Its ruler, Vladimir Putin, presides over an authoritarian regime that closely controls the key economic sectors, shackles the media, stamps out most dissent, and stage manages the political process. Nevertheless, Putin's Russia is not the Soviet Union. We should update our laws accordingly. And the problem is, I don't think he's deluded because there is plenty of evidence within the Beltway that is available. They just choose to shut their eyes. Why? Because corporate America owns most of the Republican Party and the establishment, the Clinton-Biden wing of the Democratic Party. And people would rather put their own selfish desires, their own careers, feathering their nests above that of the natural interests. And that goes back to the rotting of our political class, if you will. You would say moving away from the old aristocratic sense of guardianship over the nation and the people. I would argue it is that we've also become so hyper capitalistic and hyper individualistic. We lost a sense of balance and obligation, our economic and political elites. And I can read tons of quotes regarding Russia and China made by a lot of these free trade and pro corporate Republicans. And they all need to be held accountable. Cliff Kincaid, in a recent paper, said people like this on both sides of the right need to be held accountable. I mean, we are governed by our inferiors. I'm saying this to the audience right now. I am totally convinced of that. And Jeff Nyquist, our final question.
Mm.
What do we do as a country in regards to our response with the Ukraine? And really, how do we deal with Russia and China? We are so interdependent. We've gutted our military. I mean, what do we do? Help me.
Well, we can't do it with Joseph Biden or Kamala Harris being president. I don't see how it's possible. We can't do it with a Democratic Congress. I don't think they're capable. They are going to bungle through this until we stumble into defeat, total defeat, or we stumble towards leaders that can find a way out. Who those leaders are, they probably have not emerged yet. Nobody knew the name of Ulysses S. Grant when the Civil War began, or William Sherman. Abraham Lincoln was a brand new commodity. So I don't know who there is that's going to emerge. I'm not very impressed with the people we call leaders. I don't think they are leaders. I think they are people, they're the first to follow, right? They're finding out which way the wind is going and they're going to take a poll and be the first to follow. I don't see a lot of real leaders. Trump has some aspects of real leadership, but I don't think Trump is knowledgeable enough, and he needs the right advisors. He doesn't have that. The governor of Florida, maybe he's pretty savvy guy in many respects. I don't know if he understands the international situation. This is very complicated, Nevin, because we have been misled by active measures. There's been deception after deception. We've believed in enough of them that we're totally disoriented in this country. We don't know who our enemy is. We can't name them. We're all ready to name everybody, from the invisible Illuminati to the 9 black magicians, Kabbalist magicians somewhere hiding out, ruling the world through the banks and Masons,
You forgot the
Masonic
owl.
lodges,
You
right?
forgot the owl at Bohemian
Yeah,
Grove.
the Bohemian Grove and the Babylonian child sacrificers. I mean, look, I don't know who those people are. You haven't named anybody. You've made a boogeyman, but Russia's a real place. China's a real place. The parties around the world are real communist parties. Those we can see them acting. We can see them doing it, but I'll be darned, nobody's going to name those. And if they'll name the communists, they won't name the Russians and the Chinese. If they name the Russians and Chinese, they won't name the communists. We can't win here. We got to name our enemies. We got to be precise and exact, and we have to formulate a strategy. Hasn't happened yet. I'm
What
still
kind of
waiting.
strategy would you pursue? Let's say Joe Biden says, "It's here are the keys to the White House, Jeff. You get to appoint whatever you want, no approval necessary from Congress." Let's say they made you president like Charles de Gaulle in 1958. You take power in a military coup. Fifth Republic of France comes to the United States. Because let me tell you, I trust your judgment better than Joe Biden or Ted Cruz.
Well, look, we have to unite the country. It's the first thing you have to do. You have to tell the people on the left, look, you want to live, right? It's like that movie Terminator. If you want to live, take my hand. It's sort of like we have to unite. Then we have to recognize who the enemy is and say, look, you don't want to be with the enemy, do you? You don't really want to be a fifth column for these crazy people in Russia and China who want to destroy, the global market system and basically murder everybody who disagrees with them. You're not going along with that, are you? We need to have a consensus here. We need to have a real unity, and we need the whole West to come back together in this unity. And we have to have sensible people working together and we have to get past all the errors. We have to admit, we have to come clean and say, look, I was wrong. The Cold War didn't end. Reagan didn't win the Cold War. And no, of course, all this anti-Americanism that we've been espousing and all this hatred of the right or hatred of this or that people. Look, patriotic people, we need them. We need to be patriotic. And we are a nation, and we have to value that. And we have to preserve it. And we're not. And that's the first thing you would have to do. And then you need to get the weapons together and the organization together and the leaders together to defend, not to wipe out anybody, not to start a war, but to contain and defend, to prevent us from being rolled over by the Chinese and the Russians. And that is, right now, it's a really tall order. I don't know. They don't see it coming. I see it coming. They are much stronger than we are being told. They have weapons, the likes of which we cannot match. That's what I think.
Yeah.
And I guess we're going to find out pretty soon.
Just pray to God. What can average American citizens do? I will tell you, I've stocked up on canned goods. I normally don't eat canned goods. I eat fresh foods, healthy eater and whatnot. I've stocked up on canned goods, and I've made other preparations as well. What do you recommend to the viewers out there that they should do?
Get a lot of extra food, get extra water, get extra fuel, be ready. If you are able to support yourself, you can help your neighbor. We can get through this if we pull together. Start a garden if you're able to. If you have a little plot of land, learn to grow a garden. World War II, we had victory gardens. Look, we're going to have to do these things. Everybody's not going to make it if this comes to a world war. And there's things, all of us are going to die. Everything is not wrapped up in this world. I'm not a materialist. So, being truthful, doing the right thing, that's more important even than surviving, really. Because if you do the wrong thing and you survive, what is survived? The wrong thing. So you have to believe in transcendental values. You have to believe in truth, the truth and right and wrong, and the existence of God. That there are moral absolutes, and we have to have honesty, and we can't have honesty in government or anywhere else unless we believe those things. If you believe that this is it, that this is your life, and you die, and that's the end, and it doesn't make any sense, why not be a rotten criminal? Why not be a Joseph Stalin and try to rule the world? If that's really true, that's where these other people are coming from. That's where totalitarianism is coming from.
I couldn't have said it better. And a special side note to the left. Keep this in mind. Some of the first groupings politically that Lenin and Trotsky and the other top Bolsheviks purged was vast swaths of the Russian left. The anarchists, social revolutionaries, Mensheviks. Later in the early 20s, the workers' opposition within the Communist Party, led by folks like Alexander Shliapnikov. There were severe purges of the left in Russia. It was Vanya Kaplan, who was a Russian Jewish woman, who was a social revolutionary that attempted to assassinate Lenin.
Yeah, she shot Lenin in the neck.
This wasn't a right-wing conservative.
Almost killed him. Yeah, no, she wasn't.
I mean, after the Vietnamese took over South Vietnam, there were swaths of the Viet Cong that were purged. There were, the list goes on and on and on. It's not like it's just all the bourgeoisie and the capitalists and the middle and upper classes. They suppressed trade unions too as well.
Yeah. No, it's really
the way they suppress organized labor in communist countries would make these right-wing reactionary right-to-work people blush. And in fact, it had actually in the 30s. A few of the business funders of right-to-work liked what Stalin was doing towards Soviet trade unions.
Yeah, the moral ecology of left and right does not exist in a totalitarian system.
No, it's all about control.
Yeah, the idea of balancing capitalists off with people who are, balancing capitalists off with people who are saying, look, these capitalists are corrupt, they're mistreating people, there's some reforms that have to be done. This idea of balancing that off doesn't exist in Nazi Germany, maybe a little bit in Nazi Germany, but in the Soviet Union, they totally betray that. The workers are completely exploited.
Well, in Nazi Germany, they were exploited too, both the capitalists and the laborers. I mean, they had more of a cooperative relationship,
Right.
but
Yeah.
it was far more authoritarian than I would even recommend. I mean,
Right.
to the average libertarian and Ben Shapiro type conservative, yes, I would have certain what I would term surgically applied
Right.
authoritarianism, but to a not national socialist, a fascist, a communist, Islamist, they're scientifically applied totalitarianism where they just want to basically
Yeah.
remake man
Right.
and woman.
Yeah.
And
I mean,
that's scary. And
yeah.
we've seen
Yeah.
the
And
body
the Nazis were more giving a lot of lip service to that balance um, between capital and labor.
but they
But
control both.
they control both. Yeah, they control
But
both.
they're,
It was a little bit of a different kind of system than the Soviets, but the
of
Soviets
course,
just crushed everybody, and you had to have this absolute obedience to the center, you
yes.
know.
But
And
yet, like in Sandinista, Nicaragua,
mhm.
like in the beginning of Mao's China, like what Lenin tried to do, they also tried to co-opt the
Oh yeah,
capitalists
the right
too as
strategy.
well.
Yeah. When they don't have full power, whenever the communists don't have full power, they always try to appeal to the bourgeoisie.
That's why the
Yeah.
greatest strength of Marxism Leninism, which makes it so dangerous, I call it the theology of power. That's really what it comes
Their
down to.
flexibility,
Exactly.
the ability of a communist to actually sound like a right winger,
Yes.
as Stalin did at times. He called it the right strategy. Mao called it the yin and way.
Mhm.
But they all do it because they're adaptive and they're realistic and they understand that they have to make these compromises with their enemies, and they make those compromises very gladly, and then they just turn around and bang, their enemies are rolled up and they reap a harvest from that. Right now, they're reaping the harvest from their right strategy of pretending to be pro-capitalist, pretending to be nationalist. Now is the harvest time. They're harvesting Ukraine, and they may be harvesting all of Europe pretty soon.
Yeah, it's very frightening. They influence both sides of the political spectrum in the United States, in the West, particularly Germany, for example. And they play on both sides. I mean, Die Linke, which is the successor of the old East German Communist Party,
Die Linke
they
is German for the left, by the way, for those that don't
that's
know German.
correct. That is correct. And they have been rather, at least until recently, supportive of Putin's Russia, even sent a delegation in 2015 to the Donetsk People's Republic and saying their elections there are free and fair. And then you have the AfD, which is more on the quote unquote right, which is the immigration skeptic party. They're also pro Putin. And there have been supposedly accusations where now I just got this news right here on my Twitter. Russian troops approach Kiev as explosions heard across the Ukrainian capital. Unbelievable.
Hmm. Wow, that's fast. What kind of troops? Are these paratroops or are these
I just saw
tanks
the
and
Twitter thing. I didn't
mechanized
look.
troops?
I
It'll be
don't
interesting
know.
if they got to Chernobyl pretty quick. Kiev isn't really that far from the border, actually, from the
No, it
north.
really isn't.
There are paved roads going down in that direction. If they were able to seize them and sweep away the defenders, huh, that's terrible. Yeah, they
Yeah, it
just but
doesn't
the
say.
bombardment of Kiev happened. When I said it was 7 minutes when I made the announcement, I had gotten that Kiev after bombardment. Um, so it looks like they're going to capture Kiev very quickly. Well, there's a blitzkrieg there. How did they do it? I know there's a lot more. I've studied because I studied World War II in the Eastern Front. There were hardly any paved roads. Actually, Donbass probably had the most paved roads between cities, but between the major cities, there were no paved roads. There were railroads, and so it was very difficult once you got this wet ground condition to make rapid advances. But they have built paved roads between the major cities now. There are some of them, and the Russians must have been able to exploit those roads because Wow, that's if those are mechanized troops and not just airborne troops, that's fast. There's somebody telling me to get a report about the troops approaching Kiev. Wow, that is, yep, that's a very serious thing. So this war could be over if they can manage to cut off and surround the cities or take them very quickly. This could be over in a week. Well, that
Could
would be
be.
very fast. That would be very, very fast.
Well, since World War II, uh, I mean, during the Soviet era, from literally the Stalin era until Gorbachev, I mean, the Soviets and their Warsaw Pact allies have practiced and planned for blitzkrieg invasion of the NATO and neutral countries in Central and Western Europe.
Yes. Yeah.
And also what and the United States too, although the United States would be preceded according to those such as Major General Jan Shena and Colonel Stanislav Luna with strikes by nuclear weapons, and then succeeded by the ferrying of troops over to the United States. So those are the only two defectors that have given somewhat detailed plans against the attack against the United States, at least after the Stalin era. Um, it's going to be very frightening. Who do I think you mentioned leadership wise? The Democrats, part of them is in the pocket of Wall Street, which is stateless and nationless culturally. So that's a no go. And then you have a part of the Democratic Party. Part of them are left wing idealists. The others are more hardened leftists, would be my reading of the situation. The Republicans and the conservatives, some of them are saying the right things, but they're just so captured by corporate influence that would hamstring their ability to launch a multi-year strategic plan in the interest of protecting this nation. So I think we also have to start questioning our political structure and how our system of supposed checks and balances really is not working, because it's been thoroughly corrupted by internal as well as external forces, using those limitations on government and the ability of leaders to act to our disadvantage. And they know that, and communists have talked about that. I've discussed that in my book. There was an American POW, I think it was Colonel or Major Dickerson, who talked about it was brainwashed in a North Korean Chinese POW camp. And the Chinese officers said how these POWs would be used, brought back, repatriated to the United States as indoctrinated communists, and how they said that they would use the American Constitution and legal system against it. The National Lawyers Guild, there's a very good book by the Communist Front organization. Now it's not a front of the CPUSA, it's a left-wing, far-left grab bag of every ultra-left political persuasion, the National Lawyers Guild. Some of their top officials, like their VPs and presidents, have admitted that they use bourgeois justice of the American Constitution to basically hang itself. That's the problem. You have corporate America on the right with their interests and their plans and their priorities, and the extreme left, even some of the neo-Nazis like Dan Boros and Frank Collin of various neo-Nazi parties, using the Constitution to bring down the system, which is a very old tactic. I mean, the Nazis used that and used to joke about it. That's the problem, and we have to educate ourselves to the strategic opportunism, as I call it, of various totalitarian political parties. And the problem is, Fidel Castro reputedly was quoted in this fictional work of saying, I think it was the book Monimbo, which took place in early years of Sandinista Nicaragua. And Castro supposedly stated in this fictionalized account, in typical Castro fashion, said that the United States is a colossus with the feet of clay. And I think that's an accurate statement. And we're going to be tested in the next couple of weeks, if not months.
Well, I would characterize America differently. I would do something that the late Stan Evans said famously. So I'm quoting him, the guy who wrote Blacklisted by History about Joseph McCarthy, the real history of Joseph McCarthy. And he said, America is ruled by two parties, the stupid party and the evil party. And bipartisanship in America is when the stupid party and the evil party get together and make policies that are both stupid and evil. So that's really the problem. Can we get over that? Can we find a different way than stupid and evil? I don't know.
Well, I think you wrote in your book, and it was brilliant, in Origins of the Fourth World War. For those of you who have not read Jeff's first book, The Origins of the Fourth World War, get it. And if you can't afford it, interlibrary loan it, because it was a book that one of several books, and Jeff was one of several authors who have profoundly changed my opinion on certain issues of concern. And I like to quote these things because I think it doesn't do justice if I just, paraphrase things. So I think this is kind of important. Let me see. Let me see. Maybe not. All right. sorry. But anyways, the fact of the matter is you mentioned in Origins of the Fourth World War, basically we need a sort of new political party.